December 7th, 1941, my parents were eating spaghetti in their tiny apartment in Philadelphia when the news came over the radio on a quiet afternoon. The Japanese had attacked the U.S. naval base in Honolulu, Hawaii, in a place called Pearl Harbor. A few years later, my father was stationed in Pearl Harbor. He was in charge of the computers that kept track of every single Marine in the Pacific Theater, where they were supposed to be anyway. More than 50 years after that war ended, I got a chance to go there on that spring break mission trip to Honolulu I've mentioned before. There's something about hearing the stories my whole life long and then standing right on top of one of the ships that was sunk that day. 1941 was very long ago, but December 7th is still what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt named it in his speech to Congress the next morning, a date that shall live in infamy. Pearl Harbor Day is a critical piece of American history, a date we can point to and say, that's the day that everything changed. I love this image of the Arizona Memorial. It's cross-shaped. Sort of makes us think of sacrifice. And those men on those ships who are just going about their normal daily routine in the Peace of Pearl were without any doubt sacrificed on the altar of war that morning and conquest. If you're a student of history, if you studied any history at all, you know it seems to be made up of dates. And that most of those dates seem to be the day when some battle occurred or some war began or ended. In world history, we learn things about Rome's conquest of the universe as they knew it, the Battle of Hastings and the War of the Roses, the Franco-Prussian War, the Crimean War, and the war to end all wars, which for those who are too young to have taken world history yet was the First World War. In American history, we study the French and Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, the Whiskey Rebellion, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the seemingly endless conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. I can tell you a lot about wars and when and why they ended and when and why they started and who was in charge. But I'd be hard-pressed to tell you when and why they ended or who sat at the peace tables. I have no idea who spoke the words of comfort to the exiles and refugees driven from their homes by war and oppression from outside sources. Or who said to those desperately waiting for rescue, don't worry, help is coming. Hold on, it won't be long now. Imagine the people in France, those days before the Allies stormed the beaches at Normandy, hoping and praying for deliverance from the Nazis who had occupied their nation for 4 years. Now imagine that your land has been occupied for more than 50 years, that your children, your best and brightest, have been taken away to another country, and everything you produce goes straight into the hands of the oppressor. Your religion has been stripped away, your house of worship destroyed, so you cannot even worship your God properly. Imagine that what freedom you seem to have is an illusion, because one wrong move or word can result in the loss of what little the occupying forces have allowed you to keep. Your king is a puppet, ruling on behalf of the oppressor, doing only what he is allowed to do by the invader. He can't help you. You may not remember the good old days because, it was 50 years so far, but you know about them because the old folks keep telling the stories about how it was when the land and the people were free. In France, there were whispers. Don't give up. The Allies are coming. We're not sure when exactly, but it won't be long now. Soon, you will be free. In Jerusalem and in all the cities of Judah, Isaiah spoke those words of comfort to the people. Jerusalem, your time of suffering is at an end. A Savior comes, he told them. One sent by God with a triumphant, strong arm to free you from your oppressor, to return your children to you, to rebuild the temple and give you new life. And so it happened. Cyrus, the king of Persia, defeated the armies of Babylon, released the Jews from their exile, and provided what was needed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The people were saved, restored to wholeness by this mighty warrior whom God had sent to their aid. Roughly 500 years later, the Romans had a stranglehold on the land. The people remembered Moses rescuing the Hebrews from Egypt. They remembered the judges saving Israel from one oppressor after the other. They remembered the words of Isaiah and the Savior who came to defeat their enemies. They remembered, and they began to look for another Messiah, a Savior from the house of David, a mighty warrior and ruler who could sweep Rome away like dust is swept away by a broom. But what they got was something entirely different. What they got was an ordinary man, a wandering rabbi, a man who told them it's not about the military oppressor. It's about the internal oppressor. It's not the weight of the military yoke and the taxes and the presence of all those soldiers that's the problem here. It's the weight oppressing your heart of all the horrific burdens that you have laid upon it. Alert. I am going to use the S word here. I know we don't like that word. Try not to use it in public, and especially not in sermons. But please don't stop listening. Please don't plug up your ears, or stop reading, or turn off the video, or stop doing whatever it is you're doing to receive this message. Please. Because this wandering rabbi, this very different sort of Messiah, came to relieve God's people not of the burden of military oppression, but of the sin that oppresses each person's heart. I know that we have an understanding of sin that has something to do with rules and societal norms. For some, sin is something on a long list of behaviors and actions that they consider unacceptable, like dancing, and smoking, and fornication. We even talk about sins as greater or lesser than each other in importance. Like murder is a greater sin than just gib-slapping somebody. But the sin Jesus kept talking about wasn't a list of actions or behaviors. He often ignored the list of religious and societal rules. Rather, the sin he talked about were those feelings and attitudes and thought processes that separate us from our spiritual center, from our connection with God. Things like self-loathing, hating that which God has created, ourselves. Things like the pride and ego that make us think that we're in charge and have all the answers. Judgmentalism, thinking we know how other people think or feel, and worse, thinking we know what God thinks about how they think and feel. Selfishness, jealousy, hatred of others for whatever reason, worshiping other gods like money and possessions and beauty, greed, wanting to keep everything for ourselves and always seeking more instead of sharing with those who have less, those who need it. Fear, not natural fears like falling or fire or death, but fear that somebody will take what we have, that somebody might do something that we don't want to do, make us do something we don't want to do, or even worse, make us admit something about ourselves that we don't want to admit. of walking around with those heavy burdens on our hearts and souls, the pain of sin, that is the oppressor and the oppression that Jesus came to free us from. That is the yoke he would remove from our shoulders and replace with his own. When we have examined our hearts and found those things within ourselves and begun the work to remove them by replacing them with the love and trust in God, then that burden begins to ease. Then the oppression under which each of us lives begins to lift. And when that oppression begins to lift, we begin to see the world in a very different way. We begin to understand how this Messiah, this rabbi, is different from all the others who had come before. Moses and Samson and Ehud and Deborah and David and Cyrus. This Messiah didn't come to save Israel from a military and conqueror, but rather to deliver all the world, all of God's children, from that which would conquer from within, from that attachment to things and attitudes that the world thinks are important. It's Peace Sunday. The second Sunday in Advent is Peace Sunday every year. We sing songs of peace. We light the peace candle. But today, what we remember is the date that lives in infamy. It is Peace Sunday, but today the world is at war. There may be pockets of peace here and there, I'm not sure, because I can't keep track of it all, but there can be no real peace while there is hatred and judgment and fear. And sadly, the world around us is filled with those things. Now, we all want to find a way to impose peace upon the world somehow, to bring the whole world to a peace table where we can iron out all our differences and find a way to live together without oppression and without hatred and without boundaries even. One world, united and caring for one another. We think if we could only find the right words. Frankly, if we're serious about peace, really serious about it, we'd find a way to celebrate the peacemakers. We need to be memorializing the building where the treaty was worked out at the end of that war, and not that image on the screen, not the place where the first bombs fell on us. The day of accord, not the day of infamy. If only, right? But peace is an inside job. It begins in our hearts and our souls. It begins with the work of rooting out those attitudes that separate us from God and from one another. That sin that Jesus came to deliver us from. When we can let those things go, when we're delivered from the pain of that separation, then we can live in God's love. Then we can know peace. We can speak words of comfort to God's people. We can be that voice crying out, sharing the incredibly great good news that the Christ, the Prince of Peace, has come to bring freedom to all the world, to make the way straight in the wilderness of God, to bring peace to every